But they had to give something to George Bush to go home with. So they came up with this instant formulation, one of these wonderful European circumlocutions. Oh, they said, Ukraine and Georgia will become members of NATO. I recognized that an hour later. I was also in Bucharest, and I heard about this. I don't know don't they know what they just said? That's the moment of commitment. That's what it said. You will become NATO, not you will choose to ask to join NATO, but we will accept you. That's what the words mean. Well, two other people believed it the way I did, for sure. One was Mikhail Saakashvili of Georgia. He tested the proposition by trying to get South Ossetia fully back into Georgia. Russia came and slapped it down. Incidentally, it was during the Beijing Olympics, and it took them 5 days to win this tiny little skirmish with Georgia, and not a single NATO ally supported Georgia with military force, showing the idea of will become a NATO member didn't count. It was nothing. It was a nothing. And I said at the time, I hope we don't do something stupid with regard to Ukraine, because that really mattered to Russia and to the whole idea of Europe whole and free and at peace if you could manage it.
Hello, this is Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and I'm sitting here today with another heavyweight of US foreign policy and the modern NATO. My guest is Ambassador Robert Hunter, a retired top diplomat of the State Department and a scholar of international politics. He received his PhD from the London School of Economics and has published over 1,000 news pieces and academic articles. He also authored several books about US foreign policy and NATO. During the Carter administration, Ambassador Hunter served on the National Security Council staff as Director of West European Affairs and later as Director of Middle East Affairs. He was a member of the US negotiating team for talks on the West Bank and Gaza and was the principal author of the Carter Doctrine of the Persian Gulf. Most importantly, under President Clinton, he served as ambassador to NATO during the crucial years of 1993 to 1998. He was the principal architect of the new NATO, leading the North Atlantic Council in implementing decisions of the 94 and 97 NATO summits. He served as Secretary Cohen's Defense Policy Board and was Vice Chairman of the Atlantic Treaty Association from 98 to 01. And these are just a few of the positions that Ambassador Hunter held. Ambassador Hunter, thank you very much for taking the time.
Well, Pascal, thank you very much. And after that very generous introduction, I can't wait to hear what I have to say. Go ahead. Shoot.
I am really glad that you are talking to me, because I had Ambassador Jack Matlock here a couple of weeks ago, and I'm sure you know him very well.
Good choice.
And Ambassador Matlock was very interesting because he's quite strong in his opinion that NATO expansion was a mistake. And seeing that we now have a new war in Europe, I wanted to talk to somebody who probably holds a different opinion. So I thought that maybe the US ambassador who was crucially involved in NATO expansion, which is you, would have that opinion and could give me another viewpoint. But I am not sure what you will be saying. So can you maybe start with an introduction to how you see NATO expansion and how you see this tying in with what's happening now with the war in Ukraine and Russia? What's your interpretation?
Well, if you talk about Ambassador Jack Matlock, and do I agree with him or not agree with him, the answer is yes and no. He was there at the beginning, which was the dissolution of the two Soviet empires, the internal empire of the 16 republics and the external empire in Central Europe. And his perspective, as I'm sure your viewers have already seen, is that there was an agreement between Secretary Baker and his Soviet/Russian counterpart that NATO would not expand beyond its particular borders after there was a unification of the continent. Interestingly enough, in the so-called 2+4 talks, before I joined the government, which was the two Germanys and the four quote, occupying powers from World War II, it was agreed that unified Germany would be a member of NATO, all of it. And the Russians accepted that for a very fairly simple reason, geopolitically. We got to talk a lot about geopolitics here. Is it meant that all of Germany would be in NATO, where the United States could keep watch over it. And incidentally, one of the great champions of that was the federal chancellor, Helmut Kohl, because he recognized that even though we have a then and now a different generation, different kinds of people called Germans, you want to be sure, the line I used is the efforts of the 1990s was to make sure that in this generation of Germans, that the next generation of Germans wouldn't be able to do what their parents and grandparents had done. And it's been a tremendous success. So much so that with the current crisis, people have now convinced Germany to increase its defense spending, which I always had a little bit of problem with for geopolitical reasons, not me, but for other people, which will make, if it's done, and I'm skeptical about that, make Germany the largest military power in Europe. But the fact that other allies are prepared to live with that, that's a remarkable development, if it's a good thing at all. Now, the grand strategy created by the United States, by George H.W. Bush in May of 1989, that's before the wall fell, in Mainz, Germany, and it was to try to create a Europe whole and free. And three other words were added to that, and at peace. And the basic understanding was that you wanted to avoid what happened after World War I, when Germany was punished while it was down, made to accept in the Treaty of Versailles that it was totally responsible for the First World War, which was total nonsense. And it was done in order to have a legal basis for reparations, which the French required. Well, there was an awful lot of resentment that came out of that. Adolf Hitler went to town on it, and we saw what we saw. So the objective of George H.W. Bush, which we followed in the Clinton administration, where I had the honor to be Bill Clinton's first NATO ambassador for 4.5 years, the critical years, was to make sure as much as anything, that Russia would not be isolated and would not develop the kind of resentments that could lead them to do, for example, what's being done right now, which is a way of saying that the efforts that were undertaken by the collective people in Europe and with the United States didn't work the way we had hoped they would do. The NATO ideas in the early 1990s, begun by George H.W. Bush, carried on by Bill Clinton. And a remarkable thing about NATO in American politics, it's always been bipartisan. It's maybe the only foreign policy that's ever always been bipartisan throughout the entire history of NATO, going back to 1949. And it had several parts, and I'll just list them very quickly. Number one, to keep the United States as a European power, unlike what happened in 1919 and for a while in 1945 and 46. That's number one. And number two was to preserve Allied Command Europe, the integrated military command system, of which 29 of the third countries belong to it, except for Iceland, which has no military forces. That's never existed before in history, and there's never been an alliance like it, certainly in peacetime history. Number three was to keep the German problem solved, which began in 1866 and was finally resolved with unified Germany at the end of the Cold War. That's a long period of time, but you want to keep it resolved. Incidentally, I may as well mention it now, when it came to NATO enlargement, the first three countries that were brought in decisions taken in 1997 at the Madrid summit was to start with three countries, the most important two of which were Poland and the Czech Republic, plus Hungary. The significant things of those two countries is they surround Germany. And it's reinsurance against the German future, and where the United States, again, would be able to keep watch over Germany. Again, Chancellor Kohl was highly instrumental in making that happen. It's nice. It's the reason we have a thing called the euro rather than called the Deutschmark. Because the German currency is the basis of it primarily, but it's called the euro. It's not a German thing, even though it was dominated certainly at first by the Germans. And interestingly enough, even though the Russians did not like enlargement, they sat still for these two countries being members for the reasons I've just mentioned. If you've lost 27 million people in the what they call the Great Patriotic War, that's pretty significant. All right. And one thing that's going in right now with Ukraine is the role of memory. I think Mr. Putin has grossly exaggerated that, but he plays into a certain narrative that there are a number of older Russians still relate to the extent they even know that what Putin is doing. And most Russians today don't even know what's being done. They just don't know because of his almost total control over media within his country. Okay, so that's what 3 or 4 points. Another one was to take Central Europe off the geopolitical chessboard. It had been that area a proximate cause of the First World War, the Second World War, and the Cold War. The idea was to take these countries off that, and the main instrument of that was something I had a role in inventing in 1993 called the Partnership for Peace, which was to use the militaries of the NATO allies, plus some others. The Finns and the Swedes were very actively engaged in it. And incidentally, Switzerland is a member of Partnership for Peace. What that does to its orientation, I'll let you as a Swiss decide that I'm not going to get involved in that. Also Austria, Austrian State Treaty, which is by constitution is a neutral country. Okay. And so the idea was to have the militaries of these countries fan out into the newly independent countries and to help build democratic structures by working with, in some of these cases, the only legitimate parts of society and the ones that are easiest to work for. And that has been a tremendous success. And related to it is a thing called the Euro-Atlantic Partnership Council, which meets in NATO headquarters on a regular basis in Brussels. Incidentally, all 30, it was 35 now, was it 57, something like that now, members of the Organization for Security and Cooperation of Europe, which was the institutional product of the 1975 Helsinki Final Act, which helped bring down the Soviet Union, incidentally. And everybody's eligible to be a member of Partnership for Peace. And I helped with this as well. We convinced the Russians to join the Partnership for Peace. Theoretically, I guess it still is. I don't know whether it's doing anything. I suspect right now it's not. Okay, then the biggest problem was what do you do with Russia? You had the memory that Jack Matlock has, and I have no way of disputing what happened. In fact, when I was ambassador, we were about to do the first enlargement in 1994, and then, the first decision was 1997. I asked the State Department, was there ever a promise to Russia that NATO would not expand? And they came back to me and said, no, there was never such a promise. Well, I didn't talk to Jack Matlock, or I would have found there was a different narrative. Might have come out differently, who knows? But what do you do about Russia? So what was worked out, even though there was some talk by the Russians of maybe we could join NATO, which would have meant NATO's dissolution. And as you know, at NATO, all decisions are taken by consensus. It never votes. Any ally, now it was 16 when I was there, it's now 30, can say, I'm terribly sorry, I can't accept that decision. And it's over. That's it. And that is instrumental now in what I'll get to in a minute about Ukraine, and something that people have totally ignored. Okay, so it was worked out with the Russians, and it was done at the Elysee Palace, and I think it was the 27th of May, 1997. I recommend to people that they look it up. It's on the internet. And incidentally, at that point, the Russians already knew that there were going to be a couple of three countries were to come into NATO. They already knew it. They still signed that agreement, NATO-Russia Founding Act, with a bunch of principles in it, thou shalt not and thou shalt. and then 19 areas of practical cooperation, very important practical areas. Now, to give Russia a couple of other things, even though we felt we couldn't negotiate certain things about what NATO would do with Russia, the United States wrote 2 self-limiting paragraphs. Number 1, no nuclear weapons in any of the new allies or east of the allies, none. And that still holds. And the other is, as we go about our conventional business, we're going to do it by things we do at home and the like. But we see no need, under current circumstances, to do anything in regard to permanent forces or the like in any of the new allies. Now, it said under current circumstances. That fell to the ground in 2014 when Mr. Putin went in, seized Crimea, and went into the Donbass. Sidebar here on Crimea. Crimea is Russian. Actually, it's Tatar, but it was Russian from about 1918 on, certainly 1945. And within the Soviet Union, it was in the Russian part of the Soviet Union, not the Ukrainian part. Well, Khrushchev, who was a Ukrainian, when they got to the 300th anniversary of relations between Russia and Ukraine, he made it a present from the Russian part of the USSR to the Ukrainian part. Didn't make any difference. Didn't make any difference. But suddenly, when the whole thing came to an end and thing broke up, Crimea found itself in Ukraine. Now, if people, there weren't so many other things going on, and if people had been smart, then they would have said, "Oh, well, let's give the Ukraine, let's give Crimea back to Russia where it belonged." Didn't happen. So by the time we got to 2014, and Putin decided to correct the record on that, it was aggression. Because not only was the Helsinki Final Act, which is a prohibition on changing borders except peacefully, okay, except peacefully. And secondly, I'm sorry to confuse everybody with this, but it's all in the record, it's all in the public record. 1994, as this stuff was happening, it was a recognition that during the Soviet Union, there were nuclear weapons in 4 parts of the Soviet Union, not just Russia, but also Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan. And these 3 other countries, as they now became, said, "Hey, we don't want these things." And we in the West said, "Who knows about command and control?" So it was worked out that the nuclear weapons would be taken back into Russia, in exchange for which, in the so-called Budapest Memoranda, separately with each of the 3 countries giving up their nuclear weapons, one we care about is the Ukraine one, it said, in exchange, we, the United States, the United Kingdom, and Russia, 3 of the nuclear powers, plus France and China doing it separately, said, we will not ever pose a threat to your territory and your sovereignty. It's absolutely clear. And so it is absolutely clear and unambiguous that in 2014, Russia broke the Budapest Memorandum. And it's also clear that on February 24th this year, they were in direct violation. There is no question about that, despite all the other talk that goes on about Mr. Putin, I did it for this reason or that reason. But he had a firm commitment in exchange for Ukraine giving up nuclear weapons. Frankly, I think we're probably better off because then we'd already be in a kind of a nuclear standoff, and we'd have to think about those things. But that's another story. Okay, so now that's all the pieces of the puzzle except for one. What about Ukraine? It was understood as we were doing this in 1997. NATO-Russia Founding Act was 27th of May, and then the first 3 countries brought in the decision made to take them in July at the Madrid summit. What about Ukraine? It was understood by everybody that Ukraine was too close to Russia, too close to NATO, that it could not be in either NATO or in the Russian sphere of influence. Now, we didn't talk about spheres of influence. We didn't talk about being neutral. We didn't talk about being a buffer state, but in reality, that's what it was. And everybody accepted that, including the Ukrainians. They weren't stupid. They didn't want to say, even though they were part of Partnership for Peace, as with Russia and Poland and everybody else, but they understood if we're going to be in NATO, who knows what Russia's going to do us then, because that would put NATO right up against the Russian frontier. And that was an absolute no-no. Okay, so we created a thing called the NATO-Ukraine Charter, which I did the final negotiating with the Ukrainian representative to Partnership for Peace, Boris Tarashuk, who later became their foreign minister. And everything worked perfectly on that. And there was a NATO-Ukraine Council in Brussels. No security guarantees, but what I called a penumbra of security, that they were within NATO. Incidentally, since I've got the floor here now, one of the little cutenesses that when Boris and I were sitting there, what are we going to call this thing? And we went back and forth, and I said, well, when we were thinking about doing the thing with Russia, which is the founding act, we were thinking about calling it the NATO-Russia Charter. He says, oh, the Russians turned it down. I'll take that. So that's why it's the NATO-Ukraine Charter. Well, okay, that went along pretty well until in 2008. Well, first thing that happened, the relationship between NATO and Russia was actually excellent, despite the first countries that came in. Cut to the Bosnia War. The Russians supported NATO, UN security resolutions, which they accepted, permanent member of the Security Council, helped bring the war to a halt. And then NATO said, well, we're going to have an implementation force in Bosnia to keep the peace. The Russians said, we want to be part of that. Okay, fine, why not? And so there was a meeting in my office at NATO headquarters with Bill Perry, the Secretary of Defense, Grachev, who was the Russian Minister of Defense, and George Jawan, who was Supreme Allied Commander Europe, the Supremo for NATO's land forces, European forces, a 4-star US general. And Grachev said, I got a problem. What's the problem? I can't serve under NATO. Terrible, that's a no-no. So Jawan had brought along some charts. He said, I got an idea. All right, how about if you don't serve under the Supreme Allied Commander Europe, NATO? How about if you serve under the commanding general of the United States forces in Europe? You know, the old relationship. So it kind of makes you a quasi superpower, etc. Grachev said, great, I'd be prepared to do that. He said, okay, you will not serve under SACEUR, George Jawan. You'll serve under COMUCOM, George Jawan. Okay, no problem. Brilliant. Okay, so things worked well until 1998, when the United States and NATO went into Kosovo without a UN security resolution. That was not an attack to get the Bosnian Serbs to behave. That was against Serbia, which had a historic relationship with Russia going way back, including being a Slavic country and religion and the like. They didn't like that, so they didn't accept it. And then NATO decided, because the people understood the geopolitics and left the US government, why don't we take in some other countries? Well, why don't we start by taking the 3 Baltic states? Well, even today, well, you could say that was going a bridge too far, perhaps, but they were worried because they were right on the Russian frontier, and they'd had a bad relationship with Russia historically. But it's notable that as Putin now talks about the relationship with Ukraine, it's a historic part of Russia, and NATO is encroaching, and all that kind of stuff, which he uses as an excuse. I don't know what's in his mind. The only person who knows what's in his mind is Putin. Does he have a wife? Maybe she does. Okay, but they sat still for that. After all, they were not Slavic countries, even though there are a number of Russians who live, particularly in Latvia, who don't want to go back to Russia because they live better in the 3 Baltic states. They were also impressed into Russia as part of the Nazi-Soviet Pact of 1939. And when Mr. Putin is now talking about denazification of Ukraine, which is total rubbish. He couldn't say that in regard to the Baltic states because Russian hands, Soviet hands were dirty over what they did with the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. I'm sorry to bore you on this, but at the same time, these people in the United States said, well, why don't we take in some others? And they took in Romania and Bulgaria, and later on they took on a number of others from, including the former Yugoslavia. Now, a lot of that, we would say, was not really important for security terms beyond the first ones that were close to Russia. But a lot of them believed we want to be in the one, we want to be in the club. Two, it's nice to have a commitment from the United States, not from NATO itself, but also they thought it was going to be a way of getting a lot of foreign investment. We've been blessed by this relationship, plus that of the European Union, and there'll be a flood tide of foreign investment. I kept trying to tell them, and other people trying to say, that's not the thing, it's what you do in your economy and your democracy. That's what's going to bring in the foreign investment. But okay, so people who didn't understand that and came around and said, unlike Bush and Clinton, what the heck? Soviet Union lost the war. But Russia can't do anything. In fact, at one point they said, Russia is Guatemala with nuclear weapons. Terrible thing to say. One thing that both Bush and Clinton never said, they never said, we won the Cold War. Never said that. Everybody won the Cold War because it removed this great aura of threat from nuclear weapons, et cetera, et cetera. Well, okay, so that started creating problems of too many countries being brought into NATO to the number 30. Some of them don't matter. The ones down in former Yugoslavia, who cares? It just adds to the narrative that Putin has, but it doesn't really matter. It's the ones that were former Warsaw Pact countries, includes Romania and Bulgaria. Then in 2008, the George W. Bush administration, some people who, quite frankly, didn't really understand, in my judgment, what was really involved, said, why don't we bring Ukraine and Georgia into NATO? Georgia with all of its aspirations, but I spent some time in Georgia. And I kept saying, what's this all about? Who would want to bring, from our perspective, Georgia into NATO? I mean, what's that? What would that all be about? It doesn't do us any good. They thought it would do them some good. And it was to create, here it comes, it's wonderful, the alphabet and all the thing, what's called a membership action plan, which is a step towards becoming a NATO ally. It's kind of the last step. And so George W. Bush went to the Bucharest summit with this idea, and most of the other allies were horrified. They said, are you kidding? Give a commitment to defend Ukraine against Russia if it came to that, particularly if this kind of thing might even provoke something from Russia, which did indeed happen in 2014. They weren't stupid, but they had to give something to George Bush to go home with. So they came up with this instant formulation, one of these wonderful European circumlocutions. Oh, they said, Ukraine and Georgia will become members of NATO. I recognized that an hour later. I was also in Bucharest, and I heard about this. I don't they know what they just said? That's the moment of commitment. That's what it said. You will become NATO, not you will choose to ask to join NATO, but we will accept you. That's what the words mean. Well, two other people believed it the way I did, for sure. One was Mikhail Saakashvili of Georgia. He tested the proposition by trying to get South Ossetia fully back into Georgia. Russia came and slapped it down. Incidentally, it was during the Beijing Olympics, and it took them 5 days to win this tiny little skirmish with Georgia, and not a single NATO ally supported Georgia with military force, showing the idea of will become a NATO member didn't count. It was nothing. It was a nothing. And I said at the time, I hope we don't do something stupid with regard to Ukraine, because that really mattered to Russia and to the whole idea of Europe whole and free and at peace if you could manage it. Okay, so Instead of just killing that off, forgetting about it, every NATO summit and ministerial ever since has said, of course, every country has a right to choose its alliance. Well, that's not true. They have a right to choose to apply, but not to enter, because all the stuff about what do you need to do to become a NATO ally, and you have to become a this or that. There's only one criteria, only one. Are all the allies prepared to see the invocation of Article 5 of the NATO Treaty, which says, if you are subject to aggression from abroad, we recognize a state of war exists, and then each of us will decide what we're going to do about it. Incidentally, that limitation was put in by the United States because we didn't want to get dragged into things, but that's what it said. And nobody then, or even now, would be prepared for forget about Georgia, but Ukraine to be a NATO ally. They're not prepared to do it. Some senior people in the administration were saying right to choose up until 2 weeks before the war started. And when the Russians say right now, one of the things we have to have is a contractual thing that Ukraine will not join NATO. I mean, that could have been done 14 years ago. Could have been done in 2008, because let me state it this way, Ukraine will never become a member of NATO because it takes 30 votes or no blackball. And so that's been hanging out there, allowing Mr. Putin, for whatever his reason he's doing, to say, oh, I'm doing it because they're going to put Ukraine in NATO. So then another thing happened. This is the final thing. 2014, end of 2013, they had a president elected in Ukraine. And he was more friendly to the Russians than anybody else. And the EU negotiated something with his government on a stronger relationship. He got cold feet. Maybe the Russians told him about it, and he abrogated it, refused to sign it. There were the riots in the Maidan, which you know about, and he left. And then an assistant secretary of state, United States, got on a telephone on an open line with the US ambassador in Kyiv. And I will say the Putin perspective, and plotted a coup to have the foreign minister, the prime minister, replaced with an American choice. How do we know? Because the Russians probably recorded the phone call, and it's on the internet. You can listen to it. Okay. I challenge you to go out. You may have already heard it, but it's there. And so 17 days later, the Russians went into Crimea and the Donbass. Maybe they were going to do it anyway, but it was okay. So then we got to where we are now, and Putin kept building up and building up. I personally thought he was not going to invade, and I guess I was surprised as anybody when he actually did that, which indicates he probably had it in mind anyway for all the speculation. So that's how we got to where we are today. There was a chance to go Poland free. There were a lot of problems created because people who understood the geopolitics in both sides didn't do it intelligently. And we now have thousands and thousands of people in Ukraine being killed through, let me call it, historic diplomatic accidents, or if I may be more bold, because I fought this for all those years, stupidity. But I didn't say that, did I? Right now, we have to figure out how we deal with Mr. Putin. How do we deal with the great crime that has now been being committed in Ukraine?
Ambassador, I couldn't agree more with you. The stupidity it is, unfortunately, Europe has a long track record of doing them, unfortunately, again and again. I just want to ask you, this is why it is so brilliant to hear this from you, who's been there and seen these negotiations. One of the things that is often forgotten is that the purpose of NATO back in 1949, Ismail Hastings put it very well, or at least it said that he said that.
Lord Ismail, yes.
The purpose of NATO is to keep the Americans in, the Germans down, and the Russians out. Unfortunately, I think this has not changed. It's very important what you
Yes, it
said,
did.
that keeping Germany surrounded is actually not unimportant, and that's why this 2% goal is so weird, since it would make Germany the largest force in NATO if it actually did that spending. The other thing is the tragedy of what you just described as this process that was supposed to be comprehensive and take the Russians in and create also what Mr. Gorbachev, I mean, Mr. Bush had the idea of a Europe whole and free. Mr. Gorbachev had the idea of a common European home. Those two ideas in principle should be absolutely compatible, but what we end up with is a new confrontation between historical Cold War rivals. So is this situation that we're seeing now, is this war the failure of great power politics?
I guess the simple answer is yes. Incidentally, Lord Ismay had that wonderful phrase, and the way I said it when I was at NATO, the objective is to keep the Americans in, the Germans in, and the Russians in, and bring the Russians in what you just said, the comprehensive thing. We were not about to dissolve NATO. One thing, everybody works together, common standards, integrated military command structure, residual worries about, I mean, after all, this was right after the end of the Cold War and all oppression, communist Soviet oppression in a lot of these countries. You can't wish that away. Dealt with the historic German problem, but you also had to work out these things so everybody, including the Russians, would be comfortable with the future. Maybe it never could have worked, but it never really had enough of a college try. After about beginning of 1998, when it started to go sour, as people in the West thought they could do something different. Incidentally, let me leap ahead for a second. It's out of order. I think Russia's going to suffer no matter what happens, and not necessarily suffer in the short term, the outcome of the war, short-term sanctions, that sort of thing. But the kind of trust that had to be built up for Russia and by Russia to be looked at as a legitimate partner is going to be a long-time rebuilding, unless, of course, they get rid of Mr. Putin. If they wake up and get rid of Mr. Putin, then a lot of things might be different. Because one fact is still out there. To have European security that is a positive element rather than a zero-sum game, as you're implying, you have to engage Russia. You have to, in some form. But one thing is, I don't know anybody in any Western country who will ever again deal with Mr. Putin, ever, because he is just, because of his behavior and what he's done, maybe with some other kinds of Russians, but not by him. We also have to remember why Gorbachev did what he did with Glasnost and Perestroika. He wanted to preserve communism. He wanted to preserve the Soviet Union, but he knew it had to become modernized. And to become modernized, people had to be able to communicate, right? You couldn't just have rigid things because if you're going to go into a modern economy, people have to be able to communicate on lots of stuff. He wanted them to communicate on technology and all that, but they said, hey, we want to talk about other things. But you also have to have an open, more open economy, and particularly open to the West. And if the Soviet Union collapsed because that didn't work as he wanted, the future of Russia won't work either if they isolate themselves from the West. It's a smaller country. It's a much weaker country. It doesn't have a lot of the fundamentals of a major economy. And so what he's doing, what Putin is doing today is maybe short-term useful for his personal thing, or maybe for some older Russians, but it's a long-term, the Russian nation and Russian people are just existentially going to pay a huge price.
Can I ask you a critical question? I mean, you as a U.S. ambassador, this is, I don't know how how this plays out, but some of the things that we're seeing. So Actually, a lot of the elements that we're seeing in the Russia-Ukrainian war now remind me of things that we have seen 20 years ago in the Iraq war, and also of partially of Serbia with the splitting of Kosovo of Serbia, and also the Golan Heights. You know, the US recognizing the Golan Heights as part of Israel when in fact under international law they're part of Syria, and of course the Iraq war, which to me was a very grave mistake and a war of aggression from the United States against another sovereign nation. And Russia seems to me to copy paste a couple of these narratives. Would you agree to that, or do you think I'm off?
Well, I opposed the invasion in 2003 of Iraq. And one of the problems I've had ever since is there are certain media outlets and others who were for the war don't want anything to do with me. People who are wrong went on to other things, but that's part of history. You know, that happens all the time. One of the things Putin has said at various times is, if the United States can do to Iraq in 2003 what it did, how is that different from what I may want to do in certain places? Now, I happen to reject that view because a lot more is at stake in terms of European security, a lot more than is at stake in the security of the Persian Gulf and environs. If you're on the receiving end, it doesn't make any difference. You're still being killed. And so far, incidentally, a lot more people have died in Iraq than have died in Ukraine. And you mentioned Serbia. The Bosnia War cost about 200,000 lives. Not all done by the Serbs. The Croats were not clean-handed people for a good part of that too. They got their chunk of the spoils. But one of the striking things as we look at this, in addition to geopolitics, where I personally believe these are much more important than what's going on now, because there's so many highly industrialized countries that are involved, so great an impact with regard to the role of democracies, the role of the global economy, et cetera, et cetera. But also, and this is something that is pointed out by some columnists here, who knows where Serbia is or knew where it was? Who cares about a bunch of Arabs? And of course, there is the American support for Israel. And so the last two presidents, for example, Mr. Trump accepted the movement in the American embassy to Jerusalem, breaking the rules, the incorporation of the Golan Heights, okay, the engagement against people in Gaza, and particularly the building of settlements. All right, and Mr. Biden has not reversed any of those. All right. In fact, when there was shelling from Gaza into Israel early last year, the Israelis pounded Gaza disproportionately, and Biden waited until the Israelis got their business done before he called for a ceasefire. Okay, but so there are double standards here, but still, what's going on in Ukraine is more consequential. Oh, let me just illustrate that. During the Bosnia War, when I was working on, there were other people doing the negotiating. I did the NATO piece of it, the NATO airstrikes and all of that. It was agreed by everybody, great powers, early on, that there would not be a European war over anything that would happen in Bosnia. It was not going to be allowed by anybody to escalate into a European war, certainly not World War III. Everybody agreed on that. It was a local event contained as an event, lots of refugees, 200,000 people killed, but it was not going to be, even though Sarajevo was involved, there was no Gavrilo Princip involved. And I used to say, when I really tried to illustrate this, and it was kind of grisly, you can kill as many Austrian archdukes as you want in Sarajevo, and you're not going to have World War III. Everybody understood that. Same with Kosovo. it was not going to escalate because, like it or not, the stakes for the great powers in a real world were not there. But
Are
right
we
now, this
are
is
we in the
very,
same situation in Ukraine now? Is this the agreement, or are we in a more dangerous place?
that depends on what happens now. I will let individuals make up their own mind about how it's been conducted, right, just on the Western side. But the first thing that President Biden said when the war actually started, his people just beforehand, were saying, oh, the right to choose and all that kind of stuff, which was not smart. Okay. I tried to do something about it, but I'm just one still small voice, right? I'm out of government, and you're either in government or you're not. He said, we are not going to get involved militarily. He said on day one. That immediately gave free play to Putin. It immediately said, if it's going to escalate into something more, we're not going to do it. If Putin decides he wants to escalate, and frankly, I think that all this talk about nuclear weapons, to have any seriousness, would have to be the act of a madman. Act of a madman, because there is
He's not
nothing.
mad, is he? I don't see him as mad.
I have no idea. I don't believe. Well, he let the word go out that he was mad, all right? And then he sat 20 feet apart or whatever, however far from everybody, right? And that was not an accident. It wasn't COVID. It was far greater distance than he might have needed for COVID. It was a tactic, which was to say, maybe people think I'm going crazy, or maybe I'm compromised in terms of my immune system, and therefore I'm not rational. And that became a big deal in the West, right? Until such time as, that's why you have to pay very careful attention. And I don't know what's in his mind. That's the problem. A problem, but not that it matters if I know. When we banned Aeroflot from Western skies, he got together with a bunch of Aeroflot stewardesses, all gathered around him. Well, that shows he was not immunocompromised, because he would have never done that. It was a tactic, all right? And he mentions these things as tactics, like throwing in the nuclear thing. Well, Bush has been Biden has been very consistent. He said it again yesterday or today. We are not going to get involved with military force. So when the question came up about, this gets way down on the tactics beyond my pay grade, the question was the transfer of some MiG-29s from Poland to Ukraine. And incidentally, they're not just that old stuff left over from the Cold War. First, they would have to take the NATO communications and all that stuff off these planes, so they're no longer NATO planes, or if they get captured, they don't get all our stuff. One of the interesting things is, when we had a good relationship with Russia in the 1990s, the Russian ambassador Partnership for Peace came to me and says, a lot of our stuff that was in the Central European Warsaw Pact countries, they're now using it. Would you mind if we sold spare parts? Because we need the money. We agree, why not? So these planes are actually more modern than they were. So the fact that they're 30 years old doesn't make any difference. Well, the Poles got skittish, and that worries me, because one of the questions that's involved now, and we're going to see it play out in the near future and for a long time, and I'll come back to it in 1 second, the Poles will say, we don't want to run the risk, but we'll give them to America in Ramstein in Germany, and America can transfer them. And Biden said, no, we're not going to do that because of the risk of escalation. He also had to worry about his American audience, because, again, I always make illustrative little jokes. When the war started, most Americans thought Ukraine was a kind of Central European pastry. Okay? Now everybody knows what a Ukraine is. During both the Bosnia War and the Kosovo War, when NATO got involved with America with the lead, with airstrikes, a central principle was to try to have zero combat fatalities. And in both wars, there were zero combat fatalities. That's why we never put any ground forces and did both wars strictly from the air. Because how do you tell the American people or the people of a lot of other countries, we just lost a bunch of people for a place down in the Balkans? Where's that? So one thing that Biden has been doing is getting people used to the idea that this is important, number one, because America's sick of having wars after Afghanistan, after Iraq, sick of it. And this is something really important. Secondly, to try to build support among the allies for doing even what's being done with the supply of weaponry. The allies are now doing that. But in the back of their minds, there's an added thing, which is if Putin doesn't stop with Ukraine, and God help us if he takes the whole country. And the people who are keeping him from taking the whole country are called Ukrainians, with a lot of Western armaments, but they're called Ukrainian, fighting for their country. And when people say Zelensky is a hero, I would say a hero cued. He has been spectacular. And it may be that when Mr. Biden today said, I'm going to give another $800 million, maybe that was because, in part, this morning, Mr. Zelensky talked by Zoom to about 2/3 of the United States Congress and asked them for things. No fly zone. No fly zone is not going to happen because if you do it with NATO planes, they get shot down, then Putin might decide to go farther. He'd be stupid if he did, but he might do it. But right now, the United States is going to have to reestablish the credibility of its commitment to Article 5. Because you may have noticed what I've been saying, Ukraine is not a NATO ally, but it was said from 2008 onward, it will become member, which means it's strategically important to us. That's what it says. And so it was not in NATO, but that kind of becomes a lawyer's ploy. And because some of the others will say, no, wait a second, I'm a Balt or I'm a Pole. Yes, I'm in NATO. But if somebody is even more strategically significant to us, called Ukraine, doesn't get stuff and help and to stop the Russians, will the United States really support us? Now, Biden has said, of course, one step over the line on all of that, and I happen to believe that. But deterrence is based on belief. And so one of the most important things that Biden has to do over time is to reinforce deterrence and credibility of the United States. Let me go back and give you one important illustration. After 9/11, the only declaration of an Article 5, which the Europeans did, we didn't ask for it, to support the United States. The United States went into Afghanistan, then asked for NATO to come in, and they agreed to do it. Not because they were worried about a bunch of terrorists out of Afghanistan were going to come and kill an awful lot of people in Western Europe, though some were killed, mostly by other terrorist organizations. They were worried we would be so preoccupied with the war on terrorism, with Afghanistan, and then later with Iraq, we would forget about Europe. And it was true, and it is true now. There's only one country that can stand up to the Russians. That's the United States of America, the only one.
Now
we have to rebuild credibility.
My last question, because there's these two elements that you're presenting. On the one hand, the credibility and the commitment. On the other hand, you clearly lined out how Ukraine and promising NATO membership to Ukraine was not a wise thing to happen. Do you think?
Too late for that. You got to deal with what you deal with.
So the question, could you go back? Because one of the things that Mr. Putin demands over and over and over, and which I think is not a stupid thing, is back to neutrality for Ukraine. Ukraine had a neutrality article in its constitution until Crimea 2014. So the demand is, promise us to never join NATO and write it into your constitution that you will be neutral like Austria. Do you think that's realistic?
Well, in the first place, Ukraine was neutral until February 24th this year. Crimea didn't belong, it shouldn't have had it anyway. The Donbass, you've got the linguistic problems, all that. And some of us argued the government of Ukraine should, one, forget about Crimea. They're never going to get it back, no matter what, okay? It's really Russian, right? And nobody's going to fight for Crimea, just like once people said we're not going to die for Donetsk, but that's way back. And it is also almost certain any kind of outcome is going to lead for autonomy for certain parts of Ukraine, a tiny little part off on the right, and the so-called Donbass, those two little areas, if that's what they choose to do. Now that could have been done right on. In fact, when on the 21st of December last year, the Russians tabled these two treaties, one for NATO, one for the United States. And everybody said, oh, panicked. And oh, we can't accept all that stuff. And I said, oh, wait a second, let's do some basic diplomacy. They were tabling a negotiating document. So what you do is you negotiate on it. Well, we came back with our own ideas and that sort of thing, which were very sensible in terms of confidence building measures and notification of maneuvers, all great ideas. But instead of finding a way to sit down and negotiate this thing instead of panicking, but there were three basic elements. I can't remember the third. One of them was Ukraine not in NATO. Another one was the so-called, here it comes again, the Minsk II process, which is worked out in Minsk, and the United States is not part of it. It's Russia and France and Ukraine, and I can't remember the other country. And then there was an agreement down at Normandy in one of the anniversaries of World War II, the so-called Normandy process. But Minsk II should just get implemented. Read it, it should just get implemented. So that's two of the three major Russian things in those two treaties. Should have been accepted already, should have already been done. So I would say, what's all the fuss about Ukraine coming into NATO? They're never going to come into NATO, if only because it can't be done. I just been trying to get this point across to people who don't understand. 30 NATO allies will never take Ukraine into NATO because that automatically means war with Russia. They know that. Everybody knows that. But people keep saying it, kept saying it. So we're faced with some problems. Number one, this is a great crime. It cannot be allowed to prevail. It has upset for a long time the capacity to build a relationship in which Russia is involved in Europe whole and free for a long time. We will never again be able to deal with Putin as a person, whether he's sane or insane. If Hitler, in the early 95, had managed at the time of Yalta, I've just been reading about it, to split the United States and the United Kingdom off from Russia, Hitler was already thinking about, well, if that happens, then I'll cook a deal with the Western countries. Can you imagine sitting down with Hitler? Of course, he did a lot worse things than even Putin's done. He's dead in terms of a person we can deal with, which complicates matters. If he had not done the invasion, but that's history. You got to do with where you are. But it's important, if possible, not to solidify this into a Cold War. Capital C, capital R, because then that brings into being certain structures and certain behaviors that last forever or last for a long time. The military basis for ending the Cold War was complete by 1972 with the ABM Treaty. It's probably completed at the time of Cuban Missile Crisis, where there was a balance of what we call a second strike deterrence. We couldn't destroy them without being destroyed, and vice versa. But let's say from 1972, when they got rid of, with the ABM Treaty, with any role for anti-ballistic missiles, even though Mr. Reagan tried this thing called Star Wars, which thank God it didn't go anywhere because it couldn't possibly work. You got to get 100% of the missiles. You get 90%, you still lost your country, right? You got to get them all. It took from 1972 to 1989, that's what, 17 years, after it was possible to end the Cold War, to get it done. Certainly from 1975 with the Helsinki Final Act, which all the components are there of bringing this to an end. It still took them 75 to 89, or even 91. 89 was the opening of the Berlin Wall, and the collapse of the Soviet Union was on Western Christmas Day in 1991. So think about it. If you get all these structures put together, which we're going to have to do now, not just for deterrence, will Putin do something else and blah, 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 blah. And if there's going to be escalation, he has to take the first step. And we're not going to escalate, as Biden has been absolutely clear on, absolutely clear. Whether that was the right thing to do or wrong thing to do, that's where we are. In terms of building support in Europe for sanctions and arms for Ukraine. So a lot of people were very skittish at first. And to get the American people to understand this was important. It was probably an important thing for Biden to do. But it's very important, if possible, not to rigidify this into a new Cold War, because the classic problem that we faced in 1990, 91, 92 will still be there. Europe whole and free. And that means somehow a Russia, a different kind of Russia, different leadership in Russia that's prepared to play by rules that make sense to lots of people. Incidentally, the country that's challenging the existing order is not Russia in terms of a grand strategy, it's China. But anyway, Putin hasn't said, I want to recreate a new structure of the way people behave with one another. In fact, he keeps arguing that I'm the person who's preventing this thing from coming to pieces because I'm preventing NATO from coming up to my frontier. And he has played every time NATO's done something which has allowed him to say, we are being surrounded by NATO. I've just rolled my eyes. It's just been, well, okay, we are where we are now. And I'm just describing what I think has to happen next week in the summit in Brussels. Getting things done so Putin will understand he can't break us apart. We're going to give lots and lots and lots of arms. And we're escalating in the arms that are being provided from outside, including now high performance anti-aircraft and anti-missile capability. High performance now. The Ukrainians are going to have to do it themselves, and we're going to be training them to keep on the sanctions and keep pressing on them, not because they're going to last forever, because when the fighting stops, the countries of Western Europe are going to start saying, hey, wait a second, we can't carry on these forever. What's happening to our economies? We have elections. We are suffering now with inflation in the United States. Gasoline is now the highest price it's ever been in the United States. Petrol, whatever you want to call it, benzene. Well, when the fighting stops, people are going to say, wait a second, we got to find a way to get the price of gasoline down. Incidentally, one thing we're unprepared to do, we've been unprepared to just rejoin the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action with Iran, which Trump left, which Biden should simply have rejoined. And the irony is, if he had, then there would be a lot more Iranian hydrocarbons now on the world market. Now, I have no time for the Ayatollahs and all that kind of stuff, but the 2015 great achievement by Obama, which caused Iran to get rid of 95% of its fissile material and pour concrete in their nuclear reactor, they're back getting close to having a nuclear weapon, which they, whether they want it or not, that was dumb. But Biden should have just rejoined it, in part because the Ukraine thing, it's all tied together.
Yeah, one of the things that's easily forgotten is that Europe, Asia, and the Middle East are one single continent. For some reason, we think of them different, but they're one single thing, and they do influence each other, the politics.
No question.
But,
we have become self-sufficient on hydrocarbons.
right,
At
fracking.
least for a while. But as we always said when we kept talking about, people talked about it, our allies, great industrial heartland beyond America, which is Europe and countries in the Far East like Japan and others, are absolutely dependent upon hydrocarbons from the Middle East. And we can produce all the ones we could. That doesn't change that factor.
All right.
Number one, first thing is we have to stop Putin.
Mm.
Have to stop Putin. What he's doing in Ukraine has to be stopped because the enormity of the crime being committed there is beyond compare since the Second World War in the world to which we North Americans and Europeans identify.
Yes, excluding Iraq and excluding the Middle East, then I agree.
Serbia
and
the Balkans.
I hope that we can stop the war. I hope we can stop the escalation. But you explained today that the escalation doesn't come from nowhere. It is a long process and not just yesterday that the invasion happened. And unfortunately, the action and reactions are still playing out. My worry is that more weapons for Ukraine means more blood of Ukrainians in Ukraine and Russian blood in Ukraine. So
let me comment on that. Incidentally, we have been doing some escalation, but very carefully calibrated, not for Russia to go into things that might have too destructive things on it, like the nuclear. Number one, the alternative to say, if we don't keep giving them weapons, you just said it yourself, more Ukrainians suffer. That means capitulation. That's what it means. I'm sorry.
Yes, but you know, Japan had to capitulate and came back. Germany had to capitulate and came back. I mean, sometimes capitulation is the beginning of peace. I mean, usually.
All right. You pick up the telephone and call President Zelensky and say, fewer Ukrainians will die if you capitulate.
Which will probably be true, and he won't like it.
And he won't do it, and I wouldn't ask him to do it. Mm-hmm. And we don't know what Putin's answer would be to that, whether he wants to have the entire country or to obliterate the opportunities for Ukraine to recover, and to what extent is he sending a message to NATO about his sphere of influence in the former Soviet Union and the near abroad. It was, I believe, no accident that they attacked a military base very close to the Polish border. Very close. And that's another thing that problem for Mr. Biden next week is to reassure the allies that we will be there if this man, rational or madman, can't be stopped.
One of the tragedies, I think, is that we are back to war being the extension of politics by other means. Because you can also, yesterday, there were 3 prime ministers, European prime ministers going to Kiev, right? Highly risky, but there was no Russian attack because this is absolutely clear. You don't kill any leaders, right? So
what risk? They might have gotten killed by accident. There's no risk. Putin says you can send all the prime ministers you want, but it's any aircraft missiles I worry about, not prime ministers. Incidentally, you got to be very careful how you quote Clausewitz. I think you're probably consistent with what I'm saying. He said, war is an extension of politics by other means, meaning you have a political goal, and then war may be an instrument, but never lose sight of the political goal. That's what it's all about. Most people get it backwards.
Exactly. That's why I interpret this as Putin trying to implement a neutral Ukraine by force. That's my interpretation. I might be completely wrong. He might want to annex it, but...
Well, he could have had it for nothing. We were prepared. Well, we weren't prepared to do it, but we should have been, because where we were in 1997, and
It
where
would,
we were until 2008.
it would
And
have
even then, in
taken,
terms of implementation, there was no move after 2008 to bring Ukraine into NATO.
you know
But
what,
it was neutral. It was neutral until the 24th of February this year.
what I don't understand is that what you're saying is absolutely correct, but what I don't understand is why is not a single one of the NATO members, why did not a single one stand up, Germany or France, and just say, no, I will not allow it. I,
Yeah,
Olaf
they
Scholz,
did.
or I,
They did
Macron,
about 3
will
weeks
give the
ago.
guarantee.
They've done several times. Both the French and the Germans have said that. I mean, heck, the Montenegrins, are they in NATO yet? But Albania's in NATO. Albania could kill it if it wanted to. But anybody who's involved with NATO beyond just looking at the brand new building will know these 30 countries will never accept Ukraine as a member. Never would, won't now, never will.
So why the open door? Why the open door dialogue? Why always repeating this talking point that will never come true? I don't understand the signaling.
I don't make light of these things, but I try to sometimes use a little humor to illustrate the absurdity of certain kinds of things. Who else is there to join NATO? Okay, the Swedes and the Finns, it was always clear they could join NATO in a minute if they wanted to. The Finns are now talking, but if I were Finland, I wouldn't do it because they have a long frontier with Russia. And I wouldn't make myself a target like that because I also believe, I can't prove it, because of the nature of those societies, what they produce, the long record. If Putin went into Finland, he'd have to go away to get to Sweden. I think we would go to war with Russia if he did it. But please, I say to my Finnish friends, don't join or try to do it because we accept them. Who else? Azerbaijan, Armenia, they already dominate Armenia. Georgia, they dominate what they want now, and we already know NATO's not going to take them in. They already have in Kazakhstan a lot of what they want. Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, any stan, who do I leave out there? Moldova, don't need to because Moldova is
neutral.
I consider it's forget we're here. We're going to hide in the closet. So please pass us by. And also Transnistria, they say. Belarus has been a suburb of Russia for a long time. Mr. Lukashenko is
the lifeline is to Russia, yes, for Mr. Lukashenko.
Well, if what's the old line? If Putin said to Lukashenko, jump, Lukashenko would say, how high? You know, who's left to join that? Austria can't, by the State Treaty of 1955, forbids it. That leaves, in my judgment, two countries, Ireland and Switzerland. Do you want to join NATO? You're in the Partnership for Peace. Oh, okay. And there are a couple small places down we just took in NATO just took in North Macedonia, but that's really about being in the club and getting investment and all that kind of stuff. NATO's brand got depreciated, among other things, by having too many members. Got depreciated, and what Biden now has to do. Not just today, right now he's got a tactical problem of how do we get Putin to recognize he's not going to prevail. But then how does NATO, and particularly the United States, reestablish credibility? Reestablish credibility. Now, another thing, of course, if you're talking about credibility, look at how we left Afghanistan. Mm-hmm. The average American today, 99% of Americans would be said, what about Afghanistan? Oh yeah, we fought a war there for 20 years and we got out. Thank goodness we're out of there. Full stop. And we got out in a messy way, and there's still tens of thousands of people that work for us that can't get out.
And they're now under stifling sanctions, which is hitting the civilian population very badly.
Final thought about sanctions. Sanctions are what you do when you don't want to go to kinetic war and you don't want to be seen as doing nothing. Sanctions, historically, except maybe there's a tiny little thing here and there, may have worked in South Africa. They may have worked in Rhodesia. They probably helped get Iran to the table, but with a major power, which has strategic interests at play, they will ride out the sanctions, believing that the war will come to an end and everybody will want to get the sanctions off sooner rather than later. Now, Putin's obviously going to have to calculate, but before sanctions would really begin to bite is a considerable period of time for the average Russian.
And let's not forget that there's like 1.3 billion economies that do not play ball with the sanction game. The Chinese and the Indians both said we are not going to follow this one-on-one. So the realignment of world politics, I think, is going to be sped up through what's happening right now.
That's another subject. But one last point on sanctions. In 1976, I visited Rhodesia. I was working for Ted Kennedy and went to Rhodesia in South Africa, et cetera. Rhodesia then, as it was then called, now Zimbabwe, was under strong sanctions. I went around Salisbury, as it was then called. It's now Harare. You could buy anything in a shop in Salisbury you could have bought in Switzerland.
Mm-hmm.
Sanctions don't, when there's money involved, people will break sanctions.
Yes, and even if you can't break sanctions, if the regime is strong enough, they stay in power. Cuba has been under US sanctions for what now? 60 years, 65 years?
60.
And it's holding out.
We have kept the communists in power in Cuba through sanctions. If we got rid of all the sanctions, the average Cuban would say, let's get rid of these Charlies. Let's get rid of them. But because of American domestic politics, still today, the importance of the Cuban vote in Florida. So frankly, younger Cubans are not as wedded to that as older Cubans. So that's shifting. That's shifting. But that's the only reason we kept the sanctions on Cuba. It's because of domestic politics. Why else would we? And you think about it. For example, I don't like. There's no moral equivalence, right, to what Putin's doing. There's no moral equivalence that I'm prepared to accept. Call me bigoted about Arabs and all that kind of stuff if you want, but this, because of the security things and all that, counts for more. Why were we worried about Castro when he took power? Where we supported him, a lot of Americans supported him against Batista, is when he declared himself a communist. And then to have some protection from us, he said to the Soviet Union, hey, how about having a relationship? We couldn't handle that. And so we ran the Bay of Pigs. Okay? And then what happened, Castro went to the Russians, and there was another factor involved in this, because during the 1960 presidential campaign, John Kennedy talked about a missile gap. Okay? Soviet Union way ahead of us on nuclear missiles. He comes into office. The new Secretary of Defense goes to the president and says, by the way, you're absolutely right, Mr. President, about the missile gap. It's in our favor. The missile gap was in our favor. And one thing we did, because we were worried about that, is we put nuclear missiles in Turkey, very close to the Soviet Union. So Khrushchev said, what the hell, I'm going to put missiles in Cuba, close to the United States. Well, that was too close to us that we were prepared to tolerate. And that led to the Cuban Missile Crisis. And the most important thing, nobody won the Cuban Missile Crisis in that sense, except humanity. Because a secret the Americans kept for several years, they got their missiles out of Cuba and we got our missiles out of Turkey.
That's the deal.
But we didn't talk about it. But then Khrushchev and Kennedy, both of whom in the end behaved responsibly, said, this is stupid. And the following year, we got the Limited Test Ban Treaty. And that was the beginning of détente. Again, as I was saying, there was already, in fact, mutual assured destruction at that point, even though we didn't call it that for another decade. Fortunately. But right now, the question is, people say, is Putin rational, or when he rattles the nuclear thing?
Can we
Which scared our allies to death.
can we
And the
pin
media, all over the media here, pardon?
can we pin any hope on the OSCE or a second Helsinki process?
You mean OSCE, not OECD.
OSCE, sorry.
Ultimately, there's going to be something needed like that, which will, in fact, you could take the OSCE and build on it. But first, the war has to come to an end in a way that Ukraine is not destroyed, all right? Because this is an active war. The Helsinki Final Act, there hadn't been any shots fired between the two sides up to that point, at least not in the immediate area as opposed to Vietnam and places like that. Number one. And number two, it'd be hard to see anybody doing that with Putin still in power.
Mm-hmm.
Very hard to see that. But that is the most logical way to do it, is to work with OSCE Mark II,
Mm-hmm.
2.0.
Reviving détente.
I would say, why not get the Finns and the Swedes and the Austrians and the Swiss together and propose that. Or if you have to have somebody who's friendly to Russia, you could have Belarus and one of ours. You know, one of the wonderful things that happened is we had the UN ceasefire things in Korea, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there were 5 countries.
Yes.
And that included 2 Western and 2 Warsaw Pact countries. And all of a sudden, we had 4 countries.
Honestly, Ambassador, we would have them, Moldova and Belarus on the side of Russia, maybe even Mongolia as a tiebreaker, because Mongolia has good relations with the Russians and not bad relations with the Europeans, and then 2 or 3 Western European neutrals. This could be a way forward, but I don't think anyone is inspired enough to take this step.
If there were a ceasefire soon, okay, it is theoretically possible after a period for somebody from the outside world to come in and talk about OSCE Helsinki 2.0. But with the most important thing for us of taking part in that would be Putin's involvement because of what he's done.
Oh, that's the point about peacemaking. You can only make peace with your enemies, not with your friends. So I would hope that we get over it. But yes, I see your point. I see your point.
One of the Israelis said, I can't remember whether it was, may have been Diane, another one, when he was criticized for negotiating with the Arabs. He said, you negotiate with your enemies, not with your friends.
Yes.
One thing about the Israelis is they have never cut off contact with their enemies.
Right.
We Americans are all Simon Pure, and we won't talk to these people and that people. So what you talk to your enemies. You try to work out common things. So that's thank you for your 2.0.
Let's pin our hopes on that, because we need to keep up some hopes. Otherwise, it's a bleak world. Ambassador Hunter, I really want to thank you.
I'm an optimist.
Me too.
People like you and Heinz Gessner in Vienna, there are an awful lot of good people. I would like to see the smart people involved in various governments who could start on these things. That includes the U.S. government.
My big hope is that the US government has people like you. The State Department is a place that keeps tons and tons of very brilliant people for a long time. And I know that because I studied the Second World War and I studied like the doings of Joseph Grew and so on. And also Mr. Kennan and Jack Matlock and you.
Joseph Grew?
I just hope that
Joseph Grew, right?
Joseph Grew, yeah, Joseph Grew, the US ambassador to Japan during the Second World War. These people understood everything that was happening and understood them very clearly. And then things still can go south, but...
One great story about Grew, he was wealthy. And when he was sent out there, he had a yacht. And so I think he was Consul General in Istanbul. So he had his yacht sailed out to Istanbul. Then he got posted to Japan as ambassador, and he left the yacht behind, and he deeded it to the United States Consulate General in Istanbul. And the United States Consulate General was the only American post abroad that owned a yacht. And at some point, the Congress got upset about it, and they had to sell it, but it's now done for private charter. I've been on that yacht on the Black Sea, going up and down the Bosphorus. That's the Joseph Grew story. He was one of the problems today has to do with the structure of people involved in foreign affairs in the United States. We have too many political people who give money to campaigns, who get embassies. And so if you go into the Foreign Service, you have to understand your chances of getting an embassy at the end of your career are not that good.
Right.
30% are going to go to big money people under every administration. They sell embassies for sale. I was not career, but I knew something about NATO when I was appointed. And when I went for my hearing in front of the Senate committee, which was chaired by Joe Biden, and I was asked, how much money did you give to the Clinton administration? I said, $200,000. I said, no, $200. I was one of the first people to sign his nomination papers, for which he had to have 200 people who each gave $200. So, but there were some other people who got jobs who paid up to $150,000. I got mine cheap at the price. So, in fact,
it's a difficult world, isn't it?
One of the diplomatic world. Yeah, that's a whole nother subject about what various administrations, including this one now that a lot of things are coming unhinged, need to have access, not to me necessarily, because I'm older than you are, a good deal older, but there are a number of people who are a good deal younger that they ought to have in right now to advise them on, and they aren't doing it.
Political processes often do shut themselves off to a certain degree. And I see that happening now again.
I spent 4 years on the National Security Council staff working for Zbigniew Brzezinski. And we were encouraged to reach out beyond the government to get ideas. Sometimes it's just to find out whether you're being stupid or whether you're on the right track, but it's to have outsiders who may see things differently that you can learn from. And that's, I know it's when you're dealing with problems like this every day, it's very difficult to do it. You mentioned, I think, that I was principal author of the Carter Doctrine. I didn't do that through the regular process. I was at the White House, NSC. I had a colleague who was doing the Iranian hostage crisis. That was, up to that point, that was the most intense and complex US diplomatic engagement in the entire history. I was doing the rest of the Middle East, small stuff. And I got together 4 people from other parts of the government, state, military, Defense Department, civilian Defense Department, and CIA. And the 5 of us created the basis for the Carter Doctrine, where nobody else could pay attention to it. And I sent Brzezinski a memo and I said, we need a Carter Doctrine for the Persian Gulf. He said, do me a memo for the president. Instead, I wrote a speech. And he took it into the president while they were having a meeting with state for the 1980 State of the Union. And Carter was very smart guy. He read the state draft and he read my draft. And he said, I'm going with this one. And that's the 1980 State of the Union.
Congratulations. And that crafted an entire doctrine.
I'm not saying I was great, but it was our team that did it, okay? We had a team of smart, middle-level people.
That's the point. The United States is not just Joseph Biden. The United States is a huge apparatus of interlocking brains that do communicate with each other through very difficult channels. That's one of the difficulties when we try to figure this out in international relations. Like how does decision making then work?
Henry Kissinger had an important saying. He never liked the European Union. He said, I know who to call in Britain and France and Germany, but who do I call in Europe? Okay? He was exactly opposite. Who do you call in Washington? He thought it was him. Everybody, every foreign government, every ambassador here learns you can't just make one phone call in Washington. You got to talk to state and defense and the White House, the NSC, Capitol Hill, and the Treasury Department, and on and on and on and on to get some kind of sense of who's making the decisions. It's harder to know who to talk to in Washington than to know who to talk to in Europe.
It's a hallmark of democracies, but doesn't make international politics any easier.
I've got to go because I've got to do another thing, but I'm going to tell you one other little line. Very important. About Article 5 of the NATO treaty. Everybody, it's to invoke Article 5 or to do anything else at NATO is done by unanimity. Everything, nothing, there's never a vote taken. Anybody can put a hand up and say, Mr. Secretary General, I can't accept that. Okay, fine. So you rejig things. And when you're talking about going to war, like we were in Bosnia, and people's soldiers were going to be put at risk, reported to their nation, then it's very important that you have such a rule. But a sidebar of that is even when a lot of countries are goosey about it, they really didn't want to do it. Whenever NATO has taken a decision which entails risks, not a single ally has fallen off the wagon. NATO has never failed, never. Even when we were doing things against the Serbs and we were putting stuff for the NATO type people through Thessaloniki in Greece, all right? The Greeks who hated all of this never demurred. I remember being in a meeting with the foreign minister, Greek foreign minister here in Washington, and somebody asked him, he said, Foreign Minister, don't you have a problem with what NATO's doing in Bosnia, given the fact that the Greeks are the way they are? Don't you have your problem with your public opinion? I don't have a problem with my public opinion. Everybody's against it.
And still went forward with it.
Of course, because everybody knows if ever NATO makes a commitment and somebody stops it, or falls off the wagon, so to speak, what is the commitment in the future worth? Throughout its entire history, when NATO has ever taken a decision, nobody has ever gone subsequent against it. It's a great strength.
If it can be
when the Cold War came to an end, and we started having Russians in the building for Partnership for Peace and that sort of thing, somebody said to one of the senior Russians, or maybe it was Baker or somebody said to a Russian, or maybe still during the Soviet Union, why was it that you were deterred? He said, because we knew if we took on one country, we're going to have to take on 16.
The alliance works. The alliance does work.
If some of us not me, but some people here believed it doesn't work. The Russians believed it worked. Soviet Union believed it worked. Never tested it.
Indeed, the amazing, and maybe we end it, but the NATO was very coherent inside it. The Warsaw Pact had many more problems. The Warsaw Pact invaded itself much more than anybody else, right?
I like that line.
But
I said what happened was in Hungary, Soviets came in. Czechoslovakia, they had to come in with the Warsaw Pact. In Poland, the Poles invaded themselves.
The interesting thing is there was a proposal to bring Mongolia into the Warsaw Pact by the Soviet Union, and it was rejected by Romania and Bulgaria, who said this is too far. And that also then didn't actually happen. This alliance politics is highly fascinating. And in the end, we didn't have that war in Europe, right? But I hope we are not seeing the renewal of that now. Ambassador, I do have to let you go. Thank you very much.
One thing on that, as you know, Romania often didn't behave itself.
Oh, yes. Yes, they misbehaved.
As a result, we had a special relationship with Romania.
We will talk again, Ambassador Hunter. Thank you very much. And I will see you next time. We'll be in touch via email. Thank you.
Thank you.
Goodbye.